You've probably taken a pill today, maybe two. You didn't think about it. You pressed it out of its packaging, swallowed it with water, and moved on with your morning. But for 300,000 years, every single ancestor you have ever had faced the exact same moment. The fever climbing, the infection spreading, the body breaking down, and nothing. No doctor, no hospital, no pharmacy, no diagnosis. Just a body failing and a group of people watching it happen, trying to decide what to do next. So what did they actually do? Before answering that, consider what being sick without medicine actually means. A fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit today means urgent care, fluids, and ibuprofen. You're functional again in 3 days. For an ancient human, that same fever with no intervention had a mortality rate that would disturb a modern physician. Bacterial infections that a single course of antibiotics resolves in a week could progress to sepsis within days. A broken bone that heals cleanly with a cast and rest could become a fatal event without stabilization. The body has not changed. The biological process of illness has not changed. Only the tools surrounding it have. Strip those tools away, and the fragility of the human body becomes immediately visible. That is the world your ancestors lived in. Every time someone in the group got sick, that fragility was on full display. The assumption has always been simple. Sick meant dying. No knowledge, no system, no real understanding of what was happening inside the body, just suffering and hope and whatever time remained. Prehistoric humans as passive victims of a biology they couldn't comprehend. That assumption is wrong. The archaeological record tells a completely different story. A story of deliberate caregivers, precise plant knowledge, and a medical intelligence that operated without a single written word across hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence begins in a cave in northern Iraq, Shanidar Cave. Excavated in the 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Solecki, it contained the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals buried between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago. One individual, labeled Shanidar 1, stopped researchers cold. He had survived with a withered and partially amputated right arm, a crushed eye socket that had likely left him partially blind, severe arthritis throughout his body, injuries and degenerative conditions that would have made independent survival completely impossible. He could not hunt. He could not gather effectively. In a world where every member of the group needed to contribute to collective survival, he was, by purely functional terms, a liability. And yet he had lived for decades, well into middle age by Neanderthal standard, which means his group had made a deliberate, sustained decision to feed him, shelter him, carry him when necessary, and care for him continuously. Not once, not briefly, for years. That is not instinct. That is not accident. That is a medical and ethical decision made repeatedly over a long period of time by people who understood that this individual's life had value beyond his productive output. But the Shanidar evidence doesn't end there. Pollen samples collected from burial contexts at the same site revealed something that permanently changed how researchers understood prehistoric medicine. 8 plant species were identified: yarrow, groundsel, ephedra, and others, clustered in concentrations too dense to be accidental. These were not wildflowers that happened to grow nearby. They were gathered, carried into the cave, and deliberately placed. And here is where it gets extraordinary. Yarrow has well-documented properties as a hemostatic agent. It slows bleeding. Groundsel contains compounds with measurable anti-inflammatory effects. Ephedra, perhaps the most remarkable of them all, is the plant from which ephedrine is derived, a compound still used in modern decongestants and bronchodilators. These were not random plants. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, understood what each of these plants did to a suffering body, and they used that knowledge deliberately. Understanding what the treatment actually looked like requires stepping inside the shelter itself. The sick were never moved away from the group. Every piece of evidence from prehistoric care contexts points in exactly the opposite direction. Sick and injured individuals were placed at the warmest, most central position, closest to the primary fire. This was not comfort. This was management. A body-fighting infection runs a fever as a defense mechanism. Warmth management, keeping the body temperature regulated, preventing the additional crisis of cold exposure layered on top of infection, was the first and most critical intervention available. Fire was the first medicine. Beyond warmth, the plant compounds were prepared and applied directly. Analysis of Neanderthal dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth, has revealed plant residue consistent with medicinal use. Yarrow, poplar, which contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. The plants were chewed and pressed as poultices onto wounds. They were likely prepared as infusions in heated water. The preparation was not primitive. It was pharmacological in its precision, even if the people performing it had no word for pharmacology, and someone always stayed. The group organized around the sick individual. Evidence from multiple prehistoric care sites shows that the pattern of activity around a sick or injured person involved continuous attendance. Not visiting, staying. The group rotated. Care was not a spontaneous emotional response. It was structured, ongoing, and collective. Here is the part no documentary about ancient medicine ever covers. For prehistoric humans, sickness was never only physical. It carried meaning. It demanded explanation. A body that was functioning yesterday and failing today, for no visible reason, in a world without germ theory or cellular biology, required a framework to understand. And every human group that has ever existed has constructed one. The earliest evidence of a specialist role within human social groups, an individual who held the accumulated plant knowledge, managed the ritual response to illness, and served as the primary caregiver in crisis, appears in burial contexts tens of thousands of years old. Distinctive burial treatment, unusual grave goods, positioning that separates them from ordinary group members. The knowledge keeper, the one who knew which plant to reach for and which words to say over the body of someone burning with fever in the dark. This is not a modern invention. The role of the healer is as old as the species, because the need to explain why someone suffers and the refusal to do nothing while they do appears to be one of the most fundamental things about being human. None of this knowledge was written down. Not a single word of it. Everything that was known about fever management, wound treatment, plant preparation, and crisis care was carried inside human memory and transmitted verbally from one person to the next across hundreds of thousands of years. Think about what that actually requires. Precise botanical identification. Knowing not just the right plant, but the right part of the plant. Harvested at the right time, prepared in the right way. Dosage awareness, enough to treat, not enough to harm. Understanding of which conditions responded to which interventions. This was not guesswork passed casually between generations. It was a rigorous, accumulated body of empirical knowledge transmitted through an oral education system that predates every university, every medical text, and every laboratory by an almost incomprehensible margin of time. Studies of living hunter-gatherer groups confirm how precise this knowledge becomes over generations. Ethnobotanical research among the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of the Kalahari, and indigenous groups across the Amazon has identified plant medicine practices of extraordinary sophistication. Modern pharmaceutical researchers studying these traditions have isolated dozens of bioactive compounds that are now in clinical use or active development, not as curiosities. As medicines, the knowledge these groups carry is not folklore. It is the result of thousands of years of careful, empirical observation about what plants do to human bodies under specific conditions. Your ancestors were doing the same thing. They just had more time to refine it. Then it was lost. Not destroyed, not erased, just gradually made unnecessary. When agriculture arrived and human populations concentrated into settled communities, the accumulated plant knowledge of mobile hunter-gatherer life became less immediately relevant. Urban medicine developed its own systems. Some better, many worse. The specific botanical knowledge of the open landscape became the province of specialists, then of texts, then of institutions. By the time modern pharmaceutical science emerged, most of what prehistoric humans had known about medicinal plants had been effectively abandoned in the developed world for centuries. Then, modern pharmacology began systematically studying what traditional cultures had preserved, and the findings produced a result that genuine researchers describe as humbling. 25% of all pharmaceutical drugs currently in clinical use are derived directly from plant compounds first identified in traditional medicine systems. The World Health Organization estimates that traditional plant medicine remains the primary form of healthcare for 80% of the world's population. The compounds your ancestors identified through decades of careful observation, refined across generations of oral transmission, and applied to suffering bodies in firelit shelters tens of thousands of years ago. Those same compounds are inside the pills being manufactured in pharmaceutical facilities right now. They were not guessing. They had solved it, and it took modern science a very long time to catch up. Go back to that pill. The compound inside it has a history that does not begin in a laboratory. It traces a line backward through every pharmaceutical synthesis, every clinical trial, every medieval herbalist's manuscript, every knowledge keeper in every culture who memorized which plant reduced fever and passed that information to someone who passed it to someone else across a chain of human memory so long it disappears into a past we can barely see. Modern medicine did not begin with microscopes or chemistry sets or sterile operating theaters. It began in a firelit underground shelter, with a person lying on animal hides burning with fever, a group that had decided without discussion that abandoning them was not an option, and someone kneeling beside them in the amber light who knew, from memory, from everything everything they had been taught, from everything their teachers had been taught before them, exactly which plants to reach for in the dark. You did not discover medicine. You inherited it from people who had no safety net, no alternative, and no margin for error. People for whom getting it wrong meant watching someone die who didn't have to. They got it right. Across 300,000 years, in conditions of cold and hunger and danger that would be unrecognizable to a modern human, they built a system of care so precise that its core logic still runs through the pills you swallow without thinking on an ordinary morning. The next time you open that packaging, remember the hands that figured out what was inside it first, and understand, perhaps for the first time, how long it took to get that knowledge to you. The body that burned with fever in that shelter ran on a rhythm that still operates inside you right now. Every night, without clocks, without instruction, something inside you knows when to shut down and when to surface back into consciousness. But ancient humans had no artificial light, no alarm, no system of any kind. So how did they know when to sleep? And how did they know when the night was safe enough to close their eyes at all? That answer is in the next video.